Welcome everybody to the first Knoca workshop of 2023. It's a real pleasure to bring everybody together for a discussion around communicating climate assemblies. We in 2022 published a document called Key Drivers to Impact by a couple of colleagues from the Knoca network, which said that one of the three key drivers for impact was communication, and that aspect of climate assemblies and citizens assemblies more generally had not got the attention it deserved. So it was actually really great that Knoca could start a stream of work on this, led by Lise Deshotel. There's clearly a lack of guidance in this area for how to move forward. What is it we should be communicating? Should we be communicating process? Should we be communicating proposals and recommendations? Should we be communicating outcomes? When should we communicate? To whom should we communicate, and in what form? All of these are really open questions, and what we're trying to do is to move towards some guidance in this area. We recognize that this is going to be an ongoing process, and this is really our first step in that process of developing more rigorous guidance, and no one better to guide us through that process than Lise Deshotel, who was one of the founders of the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies. And it's my pleasure to hand over to Lise, who'll be talking about the project that she started working on this area and talk you through what we hope to be doing together for the next 90 minutes. So Lise, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Graham. And let me share my screen. Yep. Here you go. I hope everybody can see it. So today's workshop will be organized. I'll briefly present the project and then pass over. We have the chance to have today two people who will testify about two case studies that were included in the project, the Austrian and German climate assemblies, who will present some elements regarding the strategy of those processes in terms of communication, some good practice and the challenges they encountered while running and developing those activities. Then I'll try to, in 15 minutes, it's a challenge, to share the preliminary findings and recommendations or draft recommendations that will be in the report that I intend to share sometime by February. Then I suggest that we have a first round of reactions all together. I don't know at this stage how many of us are here. Yeah, something close to 50, maybe for clarifications and some elements. And then we will move to group discussions, where thanks to Mark, Elena, and Graham, we will try to facilitate discussions about trying to collect more actually good or bad practice that everybody has witnessed, because we know that in the network we have lots of knowledge about other processes, local processes or DMPs. We will also try to discuss the guidance itself, how to amend it, other ideas, etc. Communication is a very, very vast field, so what we're starting today will anyway, I think, go over, and we can have other discussions. And it's also this idea of trying to identify what should be priorities for future work of Knoca, because the report is really only a first stage. And then we'll move to the conclusion, and I hope that Graham presents a bit more the activities and what's coming up for Knoca this year, because we've been cooking and preparing some interesting things. So talking about the project very briefly, and Graham said it already, it's been quite underdocumented so far, not by lack of interest. I think there are many people here that I've discussed with where we were thinking or discussing what had been done in the French Climate Assembly and other cases, and trying to think of what was interesting, what were the obstacles, because it's very challenging to communicate climate assemblies. We're going to see that. And this first report will be produced, as I said, will hopefully be published in a couple of weeks from now. I have to share a couple of warnings here. The first one is I'm not a communication specialist. I have some experience in the field, especially public campaigning, political campaigning, etc. But this is not my field. I'm not a communication analyst. And I'm also not a researcher, so it was really interesting to try to work on that report and try to adopt a rigorous approach. That was not always easy for me. And then I think the second warning is about the fact that, as I said, it's a very vast field of practices that can be observed and that can be covered by the very generic term of communication. And here I've focused mainly on the communication from climate assemblies to the outside world and the part that is public, mainly because you can consider that reporting from organizers to the commissioner on how the process is going, etc., is communication in a way, but most of the time happens through private channels, if that happens. So as I said, we also want to discuss and take some time to think about what are the next steps, because the report will be somehow, I think, basic or maybe a bit frustrating to the most specialist of you who are already very aware of what happened around climate assemblies. But we think that many things can be discussed and many needs still have been identified through the reports, and I think that Knoca could play a role here. So here is the list of questions, and there were many more than that, and Graham mentioned a couple of them when he introduced the workshop. But I've tried to think and approach this work through this list of 6 questions, trying to think of what is the perception of the role communication should have for climate assemblies organizers, and how do they translate this perception, this role, into concrete choices when it comes to resources, when it comes to building a communication strategy, etc. Then I've tried to look at the various practices, what has been set up by climate assemblies, and what they have done. Then what were the problems they encountered, or what were the elements they had to factor in when building, for instance, the strategy, and others that emerged during and after the process. And finally, trying to think, as I said, looking forward, what Knoca can do and should do to try to help organizers and guide them when they are thinking about communicating a climate assembly, and what are the knowledge blind spots that we should further investigate. So the method I've tried to use here was actually doing a desk review using basic tools to go back and look at what happened online, what existed in terms of tools that were developed by climate assemblies, websites, social pages, also the reporting on some activities that took place, etc. I've tried to use, and I would like to thank the European Climate Foundation for this, to use some tools that they also have available, trying to use Nexus to get an insights or get some insights of what was the press coverage, and using Power BI to see the intensity and nature of the Twitter conversations around some climate assemblies. And finally, and mostly, I've used actually qualitative data that I collected through Zoom interviews, thanks to 11 people who worked on climate assemblies more or less closely on communication, who agreed to share their experience and also their opinions on some guidance that could be published, etc. And also personally, my experience as an advisor to the co-chair of the governance committee of the French Climate Assembly, where in that position, I had a lot to do or to work with the people who were in charge of implementing the communication strategy, but I also drafted it with others, etc. And of those 11 people who worked, who I interviewed, they had very various perspectives on those processes. One was a practitioner, but 3 of them were actually civil servants with a specialization in communication or not. 5 were members of PR agencies or even communication consultants, so really specialized and used to work in that field, but less used to work on climate assemblies, for instance. And 2 were civil society organizations members who ended up being in the organization structure of Climate Assembly. And I've looked, so I didn't go through the people I've interviewed worked on those 7 processes, so the French, UK, Scottish, Danish, German, Spanish, and Austrian climate assemblies. And here today, we're going to welcome Ines Oman, who was the coordinator of the Austrian Climate Assembly. And we're going to welcome as well Rabea Kos, who was a spokesperson and communication lead for the German Climate Assembly. I'll stop the presentation here and to welcome them. They will have each 5-6 minutes to present some elements, and then we'll move to the report. So maybe first, if you can, Stina, if you can highlight Ines. Hello, Ines.
Hi.
I hope you're doing fine. Thank you for being with us.
Hello, everybody. I came a bit late in from another meeting, but I think I didn't miss too much. Yeah, I'm gonna present 3 slides. So if I may share my screen, this would be great. And I do hope that it works with 2 screens. That's always a bit of a challenge. No, first I have to, sorry. Okay. So. I hope it works. Do you see?
Yes.
Also in presentation mode or not yet?
Not yet.
I just try to do it. Oh, this is always, for me, it is in presentation mode.
Yeah, we can see it fine. No worries.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I always hate it with the 2 screens. No, so give me, maybe I can.
Yes, it's fine. We can read it as it was.
Okay. Then I do it again. So is it here again?
Perfect.
Okay. So I'm talking about the Austrian Climate Assembly, and yeah, I got 3 questions from Lise talking about various strategies and challenges with regard to communication. The Austrian Climate Assembly took place last year between January and June 2022 with close to 100 randomly selected citizens. In the end, we had the report with 93 recommendations for policymakers, and now there is ongoing discussion within society, different levels of governance, and also the citizens founded an association, self-organized, and they tried to push, especially on regional and local level, that recommendations will be implemented. So now about our communication strategy. What you can see is first the objectives that were behind the communication strategy. This is now the objectives from my point of view, because we had an agency, a PR and communication agency, who are professionals doing PR and communication for political processes. And one of them is called Uli Kittelberger, and Lise had, I think, interviews with her. I did not get her slides on her strategy, but of course I know it and have it in mind. So that's my summary of what we have done. First aim was to reach as many citizens living in Austria as possible. So there was this ideal picture of, after the assembly, about 50% of people living in Austria have heard about it. Of course, we could not quantify it, but I would say we reached at least 30 to 40%. because if we now talk to people, and most of them have heard somehow about it, this doesn't mean that they know what had happened, but at least they heard about it. And way less, maybe 10–15% really know a bit more in detail what was going on. Then we wanted to reach especially target groups. And here, the idea was to reach people who can be multipliers. This might be NGOs in the social and environmental area, different associations that are strong in Austria, like the Alpine clubs and so on, or also regions. And here we had support from the European Climate Foundation. We had 2 civil society officers who focused really on reaching multipliers in Austria. And then this communication agency wanted also to reach people who are not that well informed. Should be not that, or not the well informed ones. And they really had like these different groups in society. They thought which groups are there based on statistical data in Austria. And then they focused on the concerned middle class, who are German-speaking people. This is so the bürgerliche Klasse, who are concerned but don't really change their lives. And are not too worried, and who are rather conservative, as I said. And the other one, so-called occasional environmentalists, who do what is easy but not more. The strategy did not focus on those that are anyway converted and do everything to live in a sustainable or climate-friendly way, and those that are pretty much against everything connected to climate, who are maybe skeptical that climate change is human-made and who just do not want to change anything. So this was the focus. And the third objective was really also to open up to citizens outside from the Climate Assembly and get their feedback. I'll let you know in a second what we have done for this. So with this, I come to the activities we developed. There is many, and I'll go through them quite quickly. If there is any questions, you can, of course, ask me afterwards. So we have the usual suspects like press conferences, contact to media, newspaper, radio, TV. There was a TV program accompanying for citizens along the 6 months, blog articles, social media, and so on. So this was the typical activities, I would say. Then the website was public and very at the status quo, I would say. So after each meeting, when the citizens met, all the lectures and the input papers from the scientific board could be seen there or loaded down for free, and it was all open. So there was a reach out from a scientific point of view to everybody who was interested. Then what I already told, that our civil society officers did a lot of workshops and events and tours through Austria, schools, communities, churches, and many more things. At each weekend, we had a policymaker to say hello to the citizens and appreciate their work. For the first weekend, this was the Minister for Climate Change, Climate Protection, and also our president. This was quite high level, and then it was mainly members from federal states governments. Then citizens who were interested to talk to media were trained, they got training, and they had a very strong presence in different media, especially on the local and regional level, but also on the national. There were about 20 citizens who were regularly seen in media. Then 25 mayors of the communities where our citizens come from gave support officially in a written statement form with their photos published on the website. And then we had opening up after two-thirds of our time of the Climate Assembly with Polis. Polis is an online tool that allows to get feedback to statements. And the citizens decided to give around 50 statements connected to recommendation they already thought about to publish or to decide upon, and wanted to have feedback from the public whether they make sense. If yes, fine. If not, what might be changed, shall be changed, or are there any new ideas? So after 10 days, during which the Polis tool was open, we got about 800,000 feedbacks and recommendations from 5,000 people, which was way more than we thought. And to be honest, we had not enough moderators to summarize this. So the moderators had a lot of time to come up with a synthesis for the citizens the next weekend, but it would have taken more. We would have needed more people than we had. This was more or less not in a job description of our facilitators, but they did it on a voluntary basis. My last slide is challenges and recommendations. I chose 3 challenges. Of course, we had more. The first one is to have a real professional media team with a good communication strategy. I do think this worked quite well in Austria. However, our team started too late. They started only 1 month, more or less, or 6 weeks before we had the first weekend, or 2 months before, with our citizens. Because the Ministry for Climate Action took a long time to decide how the call shall look like and how much money will there be. So challenge, have enough budget and start early enough to find a good agency. Number 2, getting policymakers as allies. This is something that did not work very well in Austria, except on the very regional level, like in communities. However, we did not have this political mandate on the national level and also the federal states level, saying that we are your allies and we want you to produce really strong recommendations. We cannot promise to implement them because you are consultative, but at least we will discuss them. And as we did not have this mandate, we tried for 6 months to get policymakers to meet with the citizens, or to get an option to present in the parliament what we do, what the Climate Assembly is all about. This worked in the end a bit due to really intense effort of some of our moderators, but we did not have them as allies, especially not the Conservative Party in Austria, who is the ruling party, the Greens we had. And the last challenge is get good journalists. So get journalists who are really motivated to accompany the whole assembly, not only for coming in once and getting out, but being there. And this means, again, you need well-connected media experts who have connections to diverse media channels and that can get the buy-in by journalists. So this is in a nutshell in my 5 or 6 or 7 minutes. I don't know how long I talked. What I can say about the Austrian climate strategy, its objectives, challenges, and recommendations, and happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ines. It was perfect, and we're now going to welcome Rabea Kos, who will also have 5 big minutes. Perfect. Hi, Rabea.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Ines, for the insights into the Austrian one. That was really interesting. I think we have a lot of strategic elements in common, as well as learnings. I'll try to maybe highlight a few that were not yet mentioned. I don't have a presentation, sorry, so I hope it's enough to just look at me and the white background. Okay, so Germany and the Bürgerrat Klima and Climate Assembly. The process was a little bit special in the sense that we organized it without a direct connection and initiation from the government. The idea came up in 2020. There were elections coming up in 21, and a strong need to have more involvement by society, more information on what a well-informed public needs. But the policymakers, the government, were hesitant to have a climate assembly because they didn't have experience with it. And I think each of the parties were kind of hesitant if it would be in their favor or not during the electoral campaign. So there were a lot of discussions in the especially climate NGOs, how to do this, if we could still have a climate assembly without the involvement of the government. And in the end, we decided yes. The Scientists for Future Germany published a paper saying that there is a need to involve society more. And that was kind of the starting point, the kickoff. So my organization, Bürgerbegehren Klimaschutz, which is a climate NGO, they said we'll take the lead, we initiate and find funding. And then we had partners with experience in deliberation, the facilitators, Nexus, IFOC, IPG, and finance came from foundations and private donors. As a patron, we had former President Horst Köhler, which was very helpful as we didn't have connection to the current government. It helped a lot to talk to motivate people to take part, to get certain experts involved, etc. So in the end, we had 160 people taking part. We had 12 sessions, and in the end, over 80 recommendations, which we then handed over to all candidates to the wanting to become chancellor. On our communication strategy, so the goal of the assembly overall was to have ideally all recommendations to be taken into consideration for the coalition agreement of the future government. In order to do that, we knew we had to, on one hand, make the assembly as credible and visible as possible, and on the other hand, have a strong connection to policymakers to ensure they would take the process serious. So important aspects of our strategy included as well to have a strong PR agency. We wanted to have an agency that was focused on political PR and campaigning, because that's not necessarily what we had strong knowledge in, and we found that. We wanted and got very strong video producers to create content, to have a professional website. And yeah, especially the video in the beginning was important to us to make, because we didn't have the official announcement by the government. We had a professional website that ensured people would find us and find more information about the process when they got invited to take part. So we had a nice video explaining what the Climate Assembly actually is, and a hotline where people could call and ask questions. Second aspect was explaining the process, of course. What do they do and why do they do it? And then the members were essential in the communication strategy. Who are actually the members in the assembly? Are they really coming from all different areas in Germany? Do we really have represented all levels of education? That's where the interest lay in from the public, and that was also important to achieve credibility for the process. In the end, we learned that that's also what the media is most interested in, to get to know the people. Then transparency of the process. We had live streaming in the beginning, and in the end, we had a lot of video interviews with different members. We had video summaries from the sessions. We had social media work with a lot of behind the scenes and influencers sharing the content. And that was really helpful for people who were not able to take part in the process to follow and understand what a citizens' assembly is, because the tool wasn't known at all in Germany. Another aspect was, of course, for the press to take part in the process. Have them listen into group discussions, but also have interviews with the experts and individual members. And then another aspect was making sure that the recommendations are being discussed during the electoral campaigns. And for that, we had the citizens, after the process was over and the recommendations were handed over, we had them discuss on their own what they wanted to do, how do they want to get involved. And they decided to make a video with a very strong call to action to the government that we then filmed in front of the German Bundestag, which was pretty successful as well. So lessons learned. We think we managed pretty well to make the assembly being perceived as a neutral body, which was important because it was started by a climate NGO. It was very helpful to have a strong support network. We had over 80, I think, organizations from all kinds of backgrounds who would support the process. They say that they are following it, that they have read the recommendations. What we would have done or would do differently next time is to focus more on the beginning of the assembly. So especially when the process is not well known yet, people need to know about the assembly in order to take part, in order to understand the relevance for the future policy of the country. So that, yeah, we would give that even more time. Already mentioned, the media is most interested in the people taking part. So they need to be briefed, they need to understand their position, and it is very important to not have certain people become the spokesperson of the whole body. So it's important to somehow navigate that, to make sure that you have different people from different backgrounds talking to media in order to make it the most representative as possible.
Thank you very much. Oh, sorry. Sorry, I thought you were finished.
Sorry, I think I have two
Please.
more points and then I'm done. So of course, it was more difficult for us to get visibility because we didn't have the connection to the government, but it also gave us some freedom because we could kind of try out some creative tools. We didn't have any restrictions on how to handle the process, on how to give access to press. So that is, I would say, also an advantage. And then very important is to have a clear strategy on how press can take part in the process. How much access do you give them, to which people and to which groups? I'll end here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rabea, and thank you, Ines, as well. For people who do have questions, do not hesitate to put them in the chat. And just after the presentation of the first elements of the report, we'll have a short Q&A, but I suggest that we focus especially on questions for Ines and Rabea at that stage before moving to the breakout rooms. So now we will move to trying to summarize those preliminary findings and recommendations with coming back to the presentation. I'll try to be short, and I'd like my Knoca colleagues maybe to tell me, like in 10 minutes from now, to start making signs and say stop. Looking at the objectives of communication, and it has been stressed by the different people that were interviewed. Generally speaking, organizers want communication to sustain the impacts that a process can have on policymaking or politicians or the policymaking class. And in that sense, it's very coherent with the findings of the knowledge development project that was led by FIDE and Bureau Berade last year. Nevertheless, when you start to dig a bit into it, and depending also on who you talk to among the organizers, you can see that communication serves many objectives at the same time. And sometimes it can actually be dangerous because some of them, it will influence the choices you make in terms of allocating resources, etc. So I've mentioned here, copied a couple of quotes from the different people I've interviewed, but you can see that for some people, it was also about trying to serve probably transparency and trying to make it credible. It's also about, it's another set of goals, but trying to, through the assembly and sharing what the assembly is doing, trying to generate interest and wider debates in society. But it's also about saying that you're doing a climate assembly and publicizing somehow the innovation and the initiative. When you look at climate assemblies, I've gathered here a couple of general observations that are absolutely not groundbreaking, because you can see that in most cases, specific resources have been dedicated to climate assembly, to communication of climate assemblies. But the Danish Climate Assembly actually stands out because it basically had no communication or very little for that. And it will be explained also in the report. It has to do with the setting of the governance and the setting of, and some independence towards the commissioner. Because who's talking for the Climate Assembly is also an element that is important. Usually communication starts sometime before the first session, more or less. And it's been commonly expressed regret that people would wish they had done more before the start, especially around the recruitment. And the French Climate Assembly was the only one where journalists and media were actually invited in the phone call centers, where you had people calling and trying to recruit members. But this was an element that was done there to try to create credibility and trust in the process, because the process had already a public image that was very connected to the president, the commissioner of the Climate Assembly. So you can also see, and I think, thank you, Ines, you really stressed that, that sometimes there is a very clear strategy to target some groups of population for the support, or for them to be specifically aware that the Climate Assembly is happening. It can be groups of people who are believed will be more susceptible of listening and paying attention to it. It's also sometimes more about trying to tell youth. For instance, there were many activities connected to youth in the frame of the French Climate Assembly, and this had to do with the context of the wider youth groups' mobilization for climate, etc. The standard tools tend to include a website, sometimes websites, one for the process, one for for the proposals, social media channels that are very known to everyone: YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. To date, we'll see if the recent developments lead to changes in the kind of social media that are favored by organizers. But also additional platforms can be used, especially when they have specific setting for the participation of the outside public, like police, DESDIM, or I think there was a questionnaire that was put online and integrated on the website of the Spanish Climate Assembly for a consultation on the topics that the Assembly was to deal with. As both Rabea and Ines pointed, the access to the media is an element that is very important, and that really varies from one assembly to another, from issuing press releases or even organizing press conferences, to contacting journalists more and trying to brief them, to giving them access to the buildings where a climate assembly can happen, or to the Zoom virtual meeting room. To small group debates, or even to experts directly, and it's important to stress that in the whole galaxy ecosystem of people around a climate assembly or in a climate assembly, everybody tends to be the subject at some point, or a voice for the communication: organizers, practitioners, experts, members, etc. But it can vary, and it will depend. And the rules that are given to the media can be and to the members can also vary a lot. You have sometimes security protocols, you have embargoes regarding the content in all of the cases. And the access can be sometimes granted to other stakeholders, like, for instance, the invitation of parliamentarians, MPs, to join and come at one of the sessions. It's very rare that the wider public is given access to the debates, but sometimes there is actually live streaming of the sessions, like it was the case for the German Climate Assembly for some parts. But access to a building was only done in the case of the French Climate Assembly, and I can testify firsthand on that. That was a nightmare to organize. How do you select and have people in the same room? It's a nightmare. Sorry, moving to the next slide. I wanted to just give you an illustration and maybe a bit of teasing regarding what's going to come in the report. So I've tried to use Nexus to get a sense of what was the media coverage in the countries. So you have to bear in mind that it's actually press coverage. So you do not have TV and radio in that database. But it was a good element to try to see how the coverage evolves. And most of the time, it's really stronger at the end of the process, around the publication of the proposals and after. For Austria, I have to say that I think the numbers will be bigger. It's also because the answer was quite recent. And it's a bit unfair where for the UK or for Scotland, they've had much more time to do some coverage, etc. But it's really interesting to see that Austria was a very well covered process. I didn't input France because actually it was so much more than those 6 that everything appears so small compared to it, so I took it out. One element that was important maybe to note about France, and we're seeing that through the Twitter conversations, is the fact, so this is for France through PowerB, is the fact that most of the conversation on Twitter, and we have to be reminded that this is a social media mostly used by media, journalists, well-informed and connected people paying lots of attention to politics and debates, public debates. So you can see that the very first peak of the conversations is at the time around the publication of the proposals, the adoption and publication of the proposals, and when a week after President Macron welcomed the participants at the Élysée and said, announced that there would be a law to implement the proposals. But then the conversation remained quite high for almost a year. And this was connected directly to the discussion, the presentation, actually the preparation with the members, the presentation of the project law, and then its debate in Parliament with a strong mobilization of civil society organizations leading in summer 2021 to the adoption of the law. And I could have kept this because very recently some debates started to peak again around the Climate Assembly because of the crisis on the energy prices, because some proposals of the convention have been revived by the media, actually, trying to say those proposals are relevant and the government could look at them, and the government took some of them in a recent plan. Anyway, sorry. What time is it? So yes, you can also see just an element that is interesting through PowerB. You can see who is talking about the Climate Assembly. And here in the case of the French Climate Assembly, it's really interesting to see that the leading account, the Voice, was one of the Twitter account of the Convention. But then you can see that it's mostly politicians, the president, plus Green Left MPs who were driving the conversation on Twitter, as well as those of very prominent civil society organization spokespersons. So it tends also to show that the people talking the more about it are the ones who deal with it and are in the climate policy field already. And it's often the case for others, even if the French Climate Assembly was discussed by many more people, those are the people leading the conversation. So when you think in terms of communication, and this was very apparent in the interviews, people stress the fact that communicating about climate assemblies comes with a set of tensions. The first one is between the practice and the organization of the deliberation, and ensuring that the participants are well, that they are not put in a position where they can be threatened by others within the process or outside, etc., and to respect also their privacy. You have to balance this with the fact that you will want to give access to other people. You will want to show what's happening in the box. And you will actually need to be transparent to build the trust in the process. So this is a first tension. There is another one that is that regards the allocation of resources and time. Even though you can always add budget for communication, etc., time is something that cannot be shared that much. And most of the time, the people chairing or who have the responsibility also need to deal with communication. And you cannot, let's say that there is a chain of command, but at some point communication can come first or can come last after, let's say, the organization or the preparation of the program. So there is always a balance here to find. And you can also be, it was a case for the French Climate Assembly. We did not want to spend more than 20%, I think, of the budget on communication, even less, I think, because the process was already labeled as being a communication operation from the president. So then it's important to show that the resources go to the process and not to do more communication. Then there is another tension that do exist and that will, I think, require Knoca's attention. It's the fact that we talk a lot about the process, and the communication is really angled on that, because you cannot talk so much about the substance and the proposals. But when the process is over, suddenly you need to change the nature of the communication to the process, its people, to policies and proposals. And this can prove very challenging also. In general, organizers actually testify that trying to foster attention and raise awareness on the process is challenging due to the fact that it's quite new and people are really not informed about what is a citizens' assembly, probably unless you live in Ireland or have lived there. But also to the fact that a climate assembly is not a standard media object or subject. So it's sometimes a bit hard to convince media to cover it because it lacks of conflict, or it lacks of some elements that are quite standard in media storytelling, because you also have this embargo on the substance, on the debates and the proposals. It can also prove hard to maneuver. If your assembly is set up in Birmingham and all the media are working in London, that can also be hard, etc. So many things to take into account, and that can be barriers to the media coverage, especially. Nevertheless, thank you, Mark. Yes. Nevertheless, it's also important to stress that this novelty and the fact that it's actually quite new and different can also help raise interest among the media. You can turn those challenges or those barriers into opportunities, but this requires works. I'll probably skip that one. Just bear in mind that there are many factors that can influence the success of the communication strategy, or let's rather say the degree of public attention that the Climate Assembly can receive. Some of them are at the end of organizers and commissioners, but some of them also depend upon external factors, the strikes, elections, COVID coming up, etc., or the fact that suddenly you have other people talking about the Climate Assembly and trying to frame as well the debate in their way because they have their own political agenda, is something that can play a role. So looking at the lessons and potential guidance, and this is really, let's say, a draft. Here, the intent is rather to try to get reactions and to get people's opinions, because I don't think we can all agree on the guidance. I have to say that myself, some days I wake up and say, like, we should not communicate about climate assemblies, and on the day after I'm just like, oh, definitely, it's very important. And some elements that Rabea and Ines were discussing, I think you will find that there is not one size fits all solution. I think there are many approaches that can be had for communicating climate assemblies. But let's try it. Firstly, I think it's very important to secure actually independence from the commissioner. In the case of the Danish Climate Assembly, my understanding and what the interviewee told me is the fact that because it was organized by the ministry and no independent communication structure had been organized, it was only the ministry who could issue PRs about the process and tell people about it. And because they were not the ones at hand and in the process and organizing it, they didn't want to take responsibility for that. So it led to a kind of silence of on the process. So that also explains this need for independence, this need for also collaboration of dedicated people working on communication who work very closely with the people facilitating the debates, preparing the design of the assembly, etc. And you need, of course, a clear chain of command, validation, dedicated resources that need to start early. I think everybody said that. You need to plan ahead, but you also need to be agile, because nothing goes according to plan, or it doesn't always go according to plan. You need to pay attention to details. And that element I was mentioning about location, moving to Birmingham was good in trying to say this is not a London elite innovation, but then it's harder to get the press or to get people coming there, etc. You can work with the media, and there are, even in the context of the very aggressive media landscape in Britain, for instance, it has been shown that you can work with the media, you can explain and get them interested and to dedicate coverage to those processes. And there is really this common testimony that once you've had people see it live, they tend to become advocate, or they tend to be to understand it better actually, and to cover it more fairly. Then, as was the case with the Austrian president and the former German chancellor, borrowing credibility from trusted public figures is really an element that is important, interesting, and the idea is really to try to get them at different levels of government, coming from different backgrounds and with different perspective on a topic. To display this plurality of endorsement is only going to reinforce the process. On members, there are different schools of thought about what should be the roles of members, but you can always see that there are members who will be willing to contribute and others who won't. And it's important to respect that. It's important, as Rabea pointed, to keep in mind that once you've started to appoint spokespersons, you're also going a bit against the logic of the assembly itself. So it's important to ensure diversity of voices. Think long term, and here I'll just mention the People versus Climate Change, the BBC documentary that was commissioned and filmed during the process and broadcasted actually quite a while after. It helps with the legacy of the process, and it serves the secondary objectives like generating public debates, trying to explain better those processes, etc. Nevertheless, a couple of warnings. I think it's important also as a network that want to guarantee quality processes. Communication is about transparency. It's about credibility and accountability also. And the healthy tension we have with the organization of the process should always remain healthy and not turn into communication versus the process. And finally, I think it's important that we start to think in terms of when those resources are allocated, because a lot has been done around the processes themselves, and the proposals do not benefit that well of the media coverage most of the time, because there are many proposals coming out of climate assemblies. And it's hard when you're the organizer to pick one proposal and to say, oh, this one is going to interest the media, let's push it more, etc. Because the members may be against that because you feel it's not right. But when a journalist receives, and this is on my personal experience, when a journalist receives 149 proposals, they don't have time to go through all of them. And chances are they will not pay as much attention as they would have if you had tried to target them and say, oh, you're working on this topic, here are the proposals on this topic that could interest you, etc. Sorry, I've been very long. I'm going to stop there. I hope there are many questions, or actually not so many questions. Mark, sorry, I'm just going to keep the thing here because I want to move to the breakout rooms in 3 minutes. So do we have questions for Rabea and Ines? Ines and Rabea, you may have seen in the chat a question from Katarina on practical tips on how to balance between participants' privacy and transparency, and how to communicate the outcomes in a way that is, as I was saying, faithful to the assembly, but so that some aspects of the output are not overplayed and some underplayed. I think ultimately you have to make a choice. But do you want to react on those two questions before we move to the breakout rooms?
Yeah, I can, maybe without having time to think a lot about them, to the first question. I think if, as in our case in Austria, the participants who are present in the media trained and do it on a voluntary basis, then it's their decision how much of a privacy they want to give and want to show. And then it's fairly okay or very okay if it's also being a bit private, because we had 4 citizens who were accompanied from the Austrian broadcast, TV broadcast, ORF, and the journalists filmed them in their job, at home with their kids, playing tennis and so on, and that's what they wanted and they liked it. And others who didn't want this, they were not present in the media. And if you have this quite clear from the beginning on, said to the participants, if you want, you can be interviewed, you can be really on a very formal level, but very informal and private, then I think there is this balance. But it's absolutely voluntarily and dependent on the participants themselves. They have to be trained. Question number 1. And question number 2, this depends on how much of the outcomes is presented anyway. Our process was a bit of a closed room process. We set up a safe space, so pretty much no content was present in the media before there was the final report, except in the police, where the participants themselves decided about 30, 40 political recommendations they want to be discussed by other citizens. I don't know about processes who have put a lot of content already on the public level or published it before the process was over. But I do want to give too much of the outcomes to the public, because this could really start a shitstorm or whatever, and would maybe frustrate the participating citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Ines. Rabea?
Yeah, just to add to that, in terms of privacy, we made sure that everyone was really well briefed. For example, one aspect was to not talk about other members' arguments or discussions within the smaller groups. So if you speak to a journalist, that's fine, and you can share your personal opinions about a certain topic, but the members were not allowed to say, person so-and-so said this, the other person said this, obviously, so that's important. And then we gave media access to also smaller group discussions, but of course only if all members in that group were okay with media being present. They were allowed to take notes and also write down quotes, but if they wanted to publish them, they had to make sure it's not about the discussion, like the content of the discussion, but more about the process. So they were allowed to say there was a big debate around the topic of cars in the city center or something, but they were also not allowed to say, this person said this person said this. And I think, yeah, you have to find a balance, but it's definitely possible, probably not without some frustration on the PR press media side.
Thank you very much, Rabea. And I see that the discussion is also going on in the chat. Very interesting. So what I propose to do now is adapt a bit what we had foreseen initially, but we're going to spend 25 minutes in the breakout rooms where you can join either Mark, Elina, or Graham or myself. And we will not have a big feedback to all at the end, but we will try to gather all the inputs, and we have a Google document that will be used, I hope, by the group leads and by anyone who wants to contribute directly to take some notes. And because the purpose is really to try to input that in the report, and maybe we can publish on the website some elements, a summary of the discussions. So we will have 25 minutes. Short. I hope everybody got the chance to share what he or she wanted during the conversations. But if you have additional questions, do not hesitate to share them in the chat, and we'll try to answer them in the summary of the discussion we'll try to produce for the Knoca website. I also welcome any contributions or remarks you may have. I'll share my email. But if you also have an interest in the project and would like to maybe take it further regarding specific aspects, if someone wants to, I don't know, set up a tutorial for how to train or how to inform the media, etc. I think there are many activities we could be running and organizing this year, and the idea is really to start this. I will share again in the chat the link to the Google Doc that was not used that much, so it's normal. It was really a backup, but if you think in the future of anything, it will still be valid, and you can I'll visit it regularly, so you can add questions, remarks, etc. I'll try to take into account what's being put in it. Graham, I think oh, Mark, you were not able to edit the document. Okay, that's actually a problem, and it's possible. No, it's possible in theory. Okay, I'll check that anyway. So Graham, the floor is yours for the conclusion.
Remember to unmute yourself. Yeah. So first of all, I'd like to thank Lise for leading us on this early part of our adventure into communications. It's clearly from the discussions that we had in our group, it's clear an issue which people really know is a vital issue, but really people aren't really sure where to go with this. I'd just like to say something about some of the up and coming activities that Knoca is going to be involved in over the next few months. We have a bunch of learning calls going to take place on a national level assemblies in Poland, Luxembourg, and the Irish Biodiversity Assembly. We've got some workshop at the end of the month on inclusion and disadvantage, and we also know there's going to be workshops on children and young people's engagement, and also on an NGO playbook. You know, what role can NGOs play in relation to climate assemblies? But really, a lot of our work is we're going to be focusing on 5 strands of work over the next few months, which we hope we can get you involved in these kind of workshops, but also in other ways. This communication work is clearly, this workshop is just the start of a longer conversation. We're going to keep working on that. Secondly, we're going to be doing work around the selection and provision of evidence in assemblies. And thirdly, around how to embed assemblies within the work of public administrations. How do we actually get that link between assemblies and public administrations working well? We're going to be carrying on work around developing an impact evaluation framework. And finally, we'll carry on our work in terms of engaging key policy actors in this debate. So there's lots going on. There's going to be, we'll post some more information about this and how you can get involved. Lots of really creative work, hopefully over the next few months, which we really do hope have impact on climate assembly practice and on wider policy change and public debate. But I would just like to finish this workshop by thanking Lise, because Lise not only has just run a really great workshop, but is also about to move on to another job. And she was one of the founders of the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies. And I hope you all agree that it was her idea, along with Alina and with Erica. And I think we've seen what the network is and can do. And so on a personal level and on behalf of the network, I'd like to thank Lise for all the work that she's done. She will keep appearing. She won't leave me alone, so I know that, but she'll keep appearing in our events, but she's going to play less of an organizational role. So thank you once again, Lise, for this particular process and for your broader work. And thank you to everyone in the network for engaging. This is just the start of the conversation around communication. Take care, everybody, and see you as the year progresses. Bye-bye.